Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
Today, something a little controversial. Something that started out so phenomenally well, but ended in tragedy. Today, the story of a once celebrated soccer player, a man whose career got off to a brilliant start, only to have it end after a myriad of events from a knee injury, to a major disagreement with his manager, to his coming out as gay, to accusations of sexual harassment, to finally suicide. Today, the story of Justin Fashanu.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Thank you once again for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes. So glad you can be here. You know, one sport we haven't hit yet is soccer. And I have received several requests to do a podcast on soccer, so today, the story of Justin Fashanu. For the purposes of today's podcast, we're going to refer to the game as soccer so as not to confuse anyone with our sport of football. One other note, Sports Forgotten Heroes concentrates on those who have had great careers, one great season, or one great game that had a major impact. And Justin Fashanu definitely falls into the latter category of having a great game. And he definitely had a great season or two. Joining me on today's podcast will be Kartik Krishnaiyer from World Soccer Talk. Kartik worked as the Director of Communications and Public Relations for the North American Soccer League, the NASL, was the host of the American Soccer Show on Champion Soccer Radio Network, the Major League Soccer Talk podcast, and the EPL Talk podcast. Currently, Kartik writes for World Soccer Talk and is the host of the World Soccer Talk podcast. Now, before we get to Kartik, though, I want to let you know that I have several links on sportsfh.com to articles and videos of Justin. That's sportsfh.com. While visiting sportsfh.com, you can also check out past episodes, read about the many guests who have appeared on Sports Forgotten Heroes, send in your comments, learn how to ask questions of future guests, or just contribute to the podcast. And thanks to all of you who continue to support Sports Forgotten Heroes, including our newest Hall of Fame member, Paul F. from Cleveland, Ohio. Follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on Facebook or on Twitter at SportsFHeroes. Justin Fashanu. He burst on the scene in 1979 playing for Norwich City, and the highlight of his career with the Canaries came in a game where he scored the goal of the year as awarded by the BBC versus the best team in England at the time, Liverpool. I have a link to that goal on sportsfh.com. Norwich City, huge underdogs at the time, were trailing 3-2, and that goal by Fashanu tied the game at 3. Ultimately, Fashanu and the Canaries lost the game 5-3, but that goal launched Fashanu into another stratosphere, and he parlayed it into becoming the first black player in English soccer history to be sold for £1 million. Here's Kartik Krishnaiyer.
It probably earned him that $1 million transfer fee. It was an amazing goal, and the symbolism was great. You're playing Liverpool, who are the perennial European champions at that time. They are the big dog in England. People didn't score goals and have that grace and elegance against Liverpool in such a venue, too. That goal led Norwich to a 3-2 victory, and it was incredibly elegant. He took the ball, one touch, created space for himself, then basically one-timed it on the volley, upper 90. If you were to use a basketball term, nothing but net. I mean, it was just spectacular. Our listeners, just check out the goal on YouTube, that goal, and you'll find it.
It's not like Norwich City was this big spectacular team. It's not a team that's going to go out and beat Liverpool. Not that they did, but that goal was just this incredible spectacle.
Yeah, and it was an interesting era at that time because there was the integration of players with Caribbean backgrounds and African backgrounds into the English game, and I know we're going to get into that in a little bit. And Norwich was one of the few teams that had those types of players, and it brought a whole different level of magic and technique to the English game. Ironically enough, my local club, the Fort Lauderdale Strikers, played Norwich City in a friendly that same season in Norwich.
Oh, wow.
And flew over from Florida, and Justin played in that match, and that was part of the thrill of playing Norwich City. I was young then. I was a kid. I was 6 years old, and I didn't quite understand the magic and value of playing against this player, but obviously subsequently learned so much. And that goal and Justin put Norwich City to a certain extent on the map internationally for a short period of time. And that is, of course, before he moved to Nottingham Forest.
Right. Hey, Kartik, welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. Tell us about World Soccer Talk, some of the clubs and players you write about, and, of course, your podcast.
Yeah, I appreciate that. WorldSoccerTalk.com is our website. We spend a lot of time talking about media in the sport, analyzing what Fox Sports, FS1, FS2, ESPN, NBC Sports, and the other networks that cover soccer in the United States are doing, in addition to covering the global game and the world game with an independent streak, a heavy dose of analysis, a lot of opinion. We've been doing this for well over a decade, and our podcast, which we have once a week with Christopher Harris and myself, is one of the longest running soccer podcasts on iTunes, and it's actually, I believe, the longest running independent podcast if you take out those podcasts associated with media publications like ESPN and The Guardian, the longest running soccer podcast now in our 12th year on iTunes.
Back to Justin. He played in 90 games for Norwich and scored 35 goals. It should have been the best time of young Justin's life. But unbeknownst to him, it wound up being the beginning of a series of events that led him to not realizing his potential, at least not at the highest level. Playing for Nottingham Forest should have been a terrific time in his life, but his relationship with the team's manager, Brian Clough, was not a good one. In fact, it was rocky from the start. Tell me about that relationship and how and why it soured so quickly.
Yeah, I'll start at the end and say that Clough in his autobiography referred to Justin as a £1 million mistake, and claimed that he had signed him just because of the goal that we talked about against Liverpool. But Clough was a odd character, a very old school character. I think many of your listeners have probably seen the movie The Damned United, which played in the United States in late 2009, early 2010. Michael Sheen was playing Brian Clough. And it came out just after Michael Sheen had this run of movies that were where he was a hot star for a little bit. The Queen, where he played Tony Blair. Then there was another movie with Tony Blair. Then Frost Nixon, where he played David Frost. The final movie in that kind of run, that Michael Sheen run, of 2 years was the Damned United. And I was surprised because it was a pretty strong box office success in the United States for a soccer movie. And it gave a lot of context into, even though there are, like most movies that are based on real life, on nonfiction characters, a bit of embellishment. But Clough was old school. He was hard-headed. He had a hard time managing players that were creative and successful, as you saw in that 44-day stint he had at Leeds United, which is what the movie's built around. All his success at Derby, and then after he left Leeds, all his success at Forest, which were smaller clubs, provincial clubs, where he made the players what they were. When he got to Leeds for that 44 days, he inherited behind Liverpool, the second biggest club in English football at the time, with all of these great players, Bremner and Lorimer and Johnny Giles and Gordon McQueen. He could not manage those guys. His personality was to do things very rigidly. So let's fast forward to Forest in 1981. He's won 2 European Cups with what is largely a provincial club, but he's still very old school, very, very tough-minded, by the book. And Justin was a creative, artistic, expressive player playing as a center forward. And I think that rubbed on Clough. And then, unfortunately, Clough found out that Justin had been going to the one gay nightclub in Nottingham. And from that point forward, it was done, because he had very traditional views about those things, Clough. Even though, politically speaking, he was on the left of the political spectrum. This is the great irony, because he was a Labour Party member, thought about running for Parliament as a member of the Labour Party. But in sports in that period of time in the UK, and also actually in the United States at that time, it was very tough to be to even have the insinuation that you were homosexual. Sports were completely different than society, and we hadn't evolved even in society at that point in the US to an acceptance of it. It took much longer in sports. I mean, if Michael Sam had happened in the 1980s, the reaction would have been very different. I can guarantee you that. So that's what he was facing, unfortunately.
So Clough had a hunch that Justin was not straight, that he was gay, because of this bar that he had frequented. Now, mind you, this is also at a time when black soccer players were the subject of these vicious verbal attacks. And being gay, as much as it is or isn't accepted today, as you had mentioned, a gazillion times worse back then. Clough had a rough time with Fashionable's off-the-field habits, and he challenged him. He didn't like it, and he wouldn't even let Justin practice with the team. Why? And if he wouldn't let him practice with the team, why did he let him play? What was the benefit?
Yeah, he wanted to keep him away because of this insinuation that he was gay from his straight men, right? In the dressing room and in training. But he had spent so much money, he couldn't justify not playing him. £1 million, we know transfer fees now are through the roof. So £1 million is just a throwaway now.
Sure.
£10 million is a throwaway for a lot of players, but it was a lot of money back then. And your point about the racism towards players of African descent, not African Americans, we're talking about Britain, of course.
Right.
Black players whose families came from the Caribbean or from Africa, was intense at the time. There was a specific game in 1979 between West Bromwich Albion and Manchester United that I remember so well, because West Bromwich Albion was really the pioneering squad of black players, and they had guys like Cyril Regis and Laurie Cunningham, and these the first real kind of generation of black players in England. And they play Manchester United at Old Trafford, and every touch of a black player, you're hearing boos and some monkey chants from the crowd. And then, of course, West Bromwich Albion wins that game. Within 2 decades, Britain's completely different, to the point where the British press are complaining about the fact that they have so many African players of African descent, in their national team. And when their national team would go to Eastern Europe or go to Spain, you'd hear these monkey chants when Sean Wright Phillips or Ashley Cole or whoever would get a touch on the ball. But it was, you just think about this. You couple the racism with the homophobia, and you can understand why he had such a rough go of it.
And that £1 million transfer fee at the time. Everything all at once. How did the other players accept Justin, or did they not accept Justin?
At Forest, it seemed like they really didn't, and that was the unfortunate thing. I mean, they had one prominent black player, Viv Anderson, who actually was really the first black player to break into the England squad in a big way. So it's not that they hadn't been exposed to a black player before, or to that sort of cultural shock. But then to have Viv Anderson very much was more conventionally British footballer in his mannerisms and the way he acted. He was one of these guys who felt like he had to fit in. he had to be a pioneer and lead that way. Not that dissimilar from Jackie Robinson, if you want to draw a comparison there, and how Jackie Robinson it took the abuse and took the and kind of conformed as much as he could into conservative white baseball society. He knew Branch Rickey had taken a major gamble, and half of baseball was against him, right? So I think Viv Anderson was very much that way. But Justin, being gay, being homosexual, coming a couple of years later, had I want to say, kind of a different way of expressing himself. And I have to stress this, and I think this is important to note too, his football, the way he played soccer, was more expressive. The touches he made on the ball, the way he ran the channels, the kind of style of football he played was much more expressive and creative, like what we were used to seeing in Africa and in Latin America, than what was at the time a very traditional and I would say conservative style of playing in Britain, where you just kind of lump the ball forward to the big center forward. Knocks the ball down, lays it off, and a guy shoots on goal. I mean, it was a lot more better touches, more technique, more creativity in his game for a center forward.
Yeah, so let's talk about his game for just a second. When he gets up to Clough's club, was he overmatched? Was he too young? Why did he struggle? Was it what was going on off the field? Why did he not excel once he got up there?
Well, I think it was an overwhelming move. I think you're right. He was young. He was 20. It was a very, very young age to make a move of that stature and to try and fit in to a team of that style. And it was a team that, essentially from a playing standpoint, should have fit him, because his teams did play with the ball on the ground a little more than a lot of British teams of the era, good passing football, etc. But he just was a cultural mismatch. He was too young. He probably at that point wasn't mature enough in his in the way he was able to train and handle himself off the pitch, which also contributed to his problems with Clough.
So his time with Nottingham Forest, he wasn't there for a long time. After just 2 years, he was sold at a significant loss to Notts County. He was playing great with Notts County and then suffered that knee injury. How good was he at that point, and was he on a path that might have vaulted him back into the limelight, or was that window closed? And of course, after that knee injury, his career really took a turn for the worse.
Yeah. So when he made that move to Notts County, he was moving across town to the crosstown rival, and was in a position where he was finally beginning to excel, and a team that was built around him, right? A team that was playing to his strengths, playing through him as the center forward, doing the sorts of things that were unbelievably geared to his game. Playing the ball up to him, playing the ball into space, letting him run onto it, those sorts of things. And he by this time is 21, going on 22, and he really begins to excel. It's a club where the expectations weren't as high as Nottingham Forest. They hadn't paid the $1 million for him. There were fans he had acquired in town in Nottingham that continued to be able to watch him. So it was a really good move for him. But then obviously he had that injury on New Year's Eve, 1983, and his playing career never recovered from that. And you add that to all the personal problems, then you have more and more problems.
Tell us, for the listeners, tell us about how the transfer fee works and how, particularly for Justin, it worked, how he was this £1 million transfer fee to Nottingham, and then they start loaning him out. How does all that work?
Yeah, so I mean, it's different than traditional American sports. What you have is a club owns the registration to a player. So Norwich City owned the registration to Justin. They sold him for £1 million to Nottingham Forest. So Nottingham Forest paid £1 million to Norwich City. In the contract, in the deal, there'll be some sort of agreement where how 5%, 10% is kicked back to the agent and the player. But that money didn't go to Justin. Most of it went, 90% of it probably went to Norwich City. Then you have a system of loans. If a player is not playing at a club, you can loan a player out to another club. And this is a system that's now getting abused in England in particular, where teams will sign more than the roster limit or the squad limit number of players, and then make it a profitable enterprise to then just loan out guys like they're an agency, right? Like they're a player agency. So you loan out guys to clubs that might be willing to take a guy for short term, might be able, particularly with young players, to allow that young player enough games to develop the number of games and playing time he wouldn't get at his parent club. It's similar. I mean, the American sports analogy would be if you're playing Major League Baseball, you send the player down to the minors.
But you're also trying to get a return on your investment, are you not?
Correct.
You're trying to earn some of that, in Justin's case, that $1 million or £1 million transfer fee back. And if you're not earning, you might, if a team can't really afford that, you might pull them back from that team and then loan them to another team. Isn't that sort of how it worked too?
Yeah, that's absolutely how it works, and we see that happen. You can watch the Premier League on any given Saturday or Sunday on NBC over the air, or NBC Sports Network, and NBCSN, I guess it's called now, the former Versus, and you'll see these conversations about such and such player has been loaned here. He's not getting enough games. The parent club won't be happy. Maybe they'll terminate the loan and loan him in the next window. And there are windows. It's just like trade deadlines in American sports. You cannot transfer a player or loan a player right now if you're an English club. That deadline was August 31st. There will be a secondary window that opens January 1st and closes January 31st. So you might see players who've been loaned out in that August window have their loans terminated 1st of January, return to their parent club for a week, and then they're loaned out to another club. It's
interesting.
It's confusing. Yeah, and it's I have to say it's become a boon for agents. I mean, agents love this thing. I mean, the more complicated this is, the better it is for them, and it's similar to free agency in American sports. I mean, becoming a sports agent became very lucrative for guys like Drew Rosenhaus once the NFL had free agency. Right before that, it wasn't quite as lucrative.
Sure. Hey, let's go back a little. His youth was not easy. His parents divorced, and he and his brother were placed in foster care, but they were placed with from what everybody says, a great husband and wife. Tell me about his formative years and his upbringing.
Yeah, his parents, one parent was Guyanese and the other parent was African. They divorced when he was about 6, and he was placed in foster care and was with a very loving family, he and his brother. Now, his brother, I think, comes into the story because he too was a footballer of some note.
Right.
And he became a heralded footballer and fell out with his brother over his brother's homosexuality. So, I think the thing that was so important was that he and John, his brother, were in foster care, and they were fostered by the Jackson family, who lived in the Norfolk area. And they allowed both brothers to kind of develop their athleticism, supported them financially. Justin actually excelled at boxing. He was a guy that could have been a boxer and could have pursued a professional boxing career, but instead pursued football, which was a lot riskier for a youth of African extraction in Britain. But they were beginning to integrate their immigrant communities into their footballing culture prior to the 1970s. And I mentioned the West Bromwich Albion team of the late 70s under Ron Atkinson. Prior to that era, the immigrant community in Britain was not integrated in their soccer/football culture at all. I mean, they could pursue sports like boxing, sports that were seen as safe to allow African people of African extraction to play in. But Britain was still very kind of white, working class, and proud when it came to football. And Justin was one of those pioneers, and his brother John, that began to blow the lid off of that.
And Justin was a little rough on or strict on his brother John.
Yes.
He was really strict on him, in fact. And if you want to be a footballer, or as we call it, a soccer player, you got to do it this way and that way and this way. You got to behave like this. What was that relationship like? Do you know anything about it?
Yeah. Actually, I mean, it's one of these things because interesting things that have evolved since Justin passed away, and John has felt very repentant because they had such a rivalry. They became an enemy. But it was one of these things where Justin was the older brother, and they were in a completely kind of white, once they moved to Norfolk, as I mentioned, or the foster parents, it was a kind of white environment. John has even said he didn't see another black person other than his brother until he was 17 or 18, right?
Wow.
I mean, that was the kind of segregated area they were in. But that basically, Justin was really, really tough on him, saying you have to be disciplined, you have to have this kind of regimen, you have to be always training if you're going to become a footballer. Otherwise, go do something else with your life. So he got a lot of, I think, a lot of the training of the mind and how you have to proceed as a footballer from his older brother. The irony being, of course, that John went on to have, by all accounts, a more successful career, a more stable career, all of those things than Justin, because of this injury to Justin and the homosexuality. John became very much a kind of mainstream hard man player, particularly with the Wimbledon teams of the late 80s, which were the Crazy Gang, which were known for physical play and strong effort. And he became, as a center forward with that team, a guy that was physical, could knock down the ball, could fly into a tackle, do those sorts of things, which British football pundits at the time really appreciated. And this is, I think, an important thing for listeners to understand, is that during that period, Britain's view of football was that it was a man's sport. It is you slide into a tackle, you play in rain, you play on these dirty pitches. If you break somebody's leg, that means you're a real man. In a tackle, they didn't legislate the game the way they do now, where if you fly into a tackle with 2 feet, you're getting sent off, you're getting a red card. In those days in Britain, it wasn't like that, and they had a very different view of it than, let's say, the way the Spanish or the Dutch viewed this sport, which was about expression, which was about your skills on the ball, your ability to pass and move and do those sorts of things. It was a very different mentality, and John certainly fit into that culture better than his brother did. His brother was elegant and silky, and would have been, quite frankly, much better off if he had been playing football in Spain. Although that would have been difficult for him being black, right?
Right.
But in the Netherlands, maybe he would have been much better off, or in France at that time, where they had integrated black footballers and were much more tolerant of expressiveness on the pitch, and the kind of cultural side that came to the game from black players who were culturally different in the way they played than a lot of white players. I do think, though, of course, his homosexuality in that era probably would have been a problem anywhere, including the United States. And it was a problem in the United States, as we'll talk about.
Right. So you could also say that John's success, or at least a part of it, was because of the way that Justin, was strict with him and saying, if you want to be a pro football player, you got to play it like this. You got to be like this. Whereas Justin, as you use the term silky, off the pitch, off the field, Justin was quite flamboyant.
Right. Yeah. And I guess that's the irony, because he taught his brother to be a straight man, which he proved to be, and had this long and successful career, and even got called into the England squad once or twice. With Justin, the flamboyance came both on and off the field. And unfortunately, I mean, I think this was part of the problem. As the rumors began to circulate that he was homosexual, that flamboyance reinforced that, and fit all the stereotypes in anglicized cultures, American culture, of the 1980s and early 1990s of how homosexual men acted.
Hey, I'm interested to know something. Let's go back for a second. You talked about Justin's fascination, we'll call it, with boxing. He was pretty darn good. Twice he was a British amateur junior heavyweight finalist. Why did he walk away from the boxing ring and go towards soccer?
I think it was probably, and this I'm speculating on. This is the first thing that I can't give you factual description. I'm thinking it was just the ability to make money in soccer, football, and the maybe the social acceptance. It was, and it was something he was also very good with, and was able to use his physicality, right? His physicality that he developed as a boxer, and I think one of the things we found in latter days, as training techniques became more commonplace, is that movement and the way you use your feet. I mean, I've read people like Dirk Nowitzki and Roger Federer talk about this, where and Andy Murray will play soccer because he feels like it helps his feet, his movement on the tennis court, right? And Nowitzki's talked about things like that. I think boxing probably helped Justin with his movement, right? And
Interesting.
Movement on a soccer pitch. You realize in order to avoid certain confrontations with defensive players, you have to navigate in certain ways. And it's really interesting. And I know now a lot of soccer players are playing tennis and volleyball because they feel like it helps with certain movements and fitness and planning of your feet and things like that. There's a lot of overlap, and there's the obvious overlap between some of the American sports and soccer as well. I mean, Chad Ochocinco's talked a lot about it, that some of his movement, some of his footwork when he's running. If you're running a fly pattern, that's one thing, right? You're just going straight. The quarterback is throwing the ball
right
over one of your shoulders. But if you're running a button hook pattern or some sort of other complicated pattern as a wide receiver, Ochocinco's talked about how playing soccer as a youngster, and we know he's continued to play soccer. Actually, thought about changing careers, right? At one point, and the Bengals blocked him, or playing or being dual sport like Deion Sanders was. That movement in the way he runs pass patterns comes from being conscious of where his feet are from playing soccer. So there's a lot of overlap, and I think Justin probably benefited from boxing. I mean, we hear about the similarities between team sports, soccer, basketball, football, but I'm guessing that there is value in being a boxer and showing an ability to kind of use your body and your feet. Ironically enough, as we record this, Rio Ferdinand, who was a great player for England, great player for Manchester United and Leeds United and West Ham United, now is considering, and he's retired from football a year or two ago, is considering a change to become a boxer. So that's I think that's quite kind of significant. There is some overlap.
And I guess for Justin too, as you were describing earlier, how tough the game was, it made him that much tougher on the field as well. It enabled him to play a tougher game and withstand bigger hits from his position on the field.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Because as I said, I mean, the game is physical now, and I think part of the reason they've legislated the physicality of the game, you hear all these British pundits at times say, "Oh, the game is now players are soft. It isn't like it used to be 30 years ago." And you hear that in every sport, right? You hear about in basketball now, oh, they call fouls for what used to just be incidental. And my gosh, you're always changing the rules in football. You can't lay a hand on a quarterback. All of that is true, but part of it is because of the evolution of equipment. Now in soccer, if you go with 2 feet and you try and take someone's leg out, you've got these spiked cleats. And generally, because of the improvements in technology and the speed of the game, the player you're tackling is probably moving a lot faster. So there's a greater possibility of injuries, even career-ending injuries. In that day and age, none of this stuff was legislated. So if you were a center forward, um, you could, if like Justin was, you could expect elbows, you could expect, every kind of physical contact. And sometimes the referee would call it. More often than not, they wouldn't. So that boxing um, frame and that boxing experience, I think, really helped him get through that because he was a silky player, um, more so than so many of the other center forwards in England during that period of time.
So that goal against Liverpool really had an effect in so many different ways. Um, how much potential did Justin have? And by getting called up, we'll say, or transferred to the big club, how much of an effect, let's take his sexual preference out of this, how much of an effect did this being transferred to Nottingham Forest, how much of an effect did that have on him as far as being unable to realize his potential? Was there that much potential?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a couple things. One, he was too young and too immature to be at a club of that size, and hadn't developed as a player. He had only been playing professionally for 2 years at that point when he made the switch to Forest, and he wasn't ready for a manager like Brian Clough. The second thing I would mention, and this is the kind of the dark side of the story, is he came into money quickly, right? Because he gets $1 million transfer fee. They pay him. I'm not quite sure what his wage was, but it was pretty astronomical for the period of time. And he started spending money, obviously going out to the gay club in town, but also spending money on fast cars and just the kind of frivolous type of things that we see so often. We see it all the time now, unfortunately, from English footballers still in this era. I mean, I could list a number of guys the last 10 years who've gotten their first big contract and then have gone bad. They've gone and bought a Rolls or some sort of sports car,
Right.
running off the curve. We see it in the NFL when guys leave college early and they're drafted. Obviously, you have to play 3 years of college football. Well, not anymore, right? You used to have to play, right? And you see guys like Johnny Football, for one example. He comes into money and he can't control himself. So, unfortunately, there is that side of the Justin story. There are stories of him borrowing money from people, never paying them back, um, crying hardship, and needing help from fellow footballers, people in the game, and then him being out on a bender the next night, right? So that's and I shouldn't say a bender because that implies alcohol.
Right.
I shouldn't say that. That's the wrong term. But being out at the gay club, being out till late, getting in his car and revving and going 100 miles per hour down the motorway between Nottingham and Leicester or wherever on the M1. So
It was youth.
Some of that.
Yeah, it was youth. Sometimes in baseball, there are those who are just too good for AAA and they just don't pan out in the majors. And we take a look back at Justin's career. He kept trying to work his way back up, but as we discussed earlier, that knee injury certainly had a devastating effect on him. Was he just that kind of player? And putting it in American terms, he was a really good AAA player, but after all that had happened, he just couldn't make it to the big show.
Yeah, we see this in soccer in England a lot now. Even guys who are very good at smaller clubs bag a bunch of goals, but if they get a move to a Liverpool or a Manchester City or a Tottenham or Arsenal, they're not that good. And there are guys we call championship players rather than Premier League players because they're really good at the second level, but they're not Premier League title winning type players that you can have on those sorts of teams. He might have been that. The thing that I guess makes it difficult to accept that was the case was because his brother was so good, ended up being such a good player, and that's something that is difficult to reconcile with the fact that he was supposedly that much better than his brother. And he, of course, got them, was able to play for England's team at the U21 level, and he bagged a bunch of goals. But then he was never called into the senior England team because by that time, things had gone pretty bad. So that was the unfortunate thing. He might have been one of these guys who just never reached their potential, or he could be and I'm in Florida, so sorry for the analogy for those of you who aren't. I went to the University of Florida. I grew up a University of Miami fan, so he might be a Tim Tebow. He might be a Ken Dorsey, just like this really good player at the equivalent of the college level that wasn't cut out for the NFL.
What could he have done differently? Is there anything he could have done differently to help him realize that potential, or did he just take a wrong turn and there was no recovering from it?
Yeah, I think the wrong turn was also based on a certain degree of paranoia, because he knew he was gay. He was keeping the secret for a while, and he was conscious of the fact that he was black, and also the confrontation with Clough. I think had he not made the move to Forest, had he stayed at Norwich another year or two, ended up going to another club, he might have been. It might have ended up very differently for him. I mean, the thing that ended up happening later in his career is there would be big English clubs like West Ham and Manchester City and a few others that would take a chance on him just based on who he had been, the potential, the story, and he'd make 3 or 4 appearances at those clubs and get released. And Newcastle was another one. I remember very clearly.
Didn't he score goals for these teams, or isn't that what he was supposed to be doing, scoring goals? So that's where I'm conflicted, that he would score goals, but he just couldn't advance.
Yeah, again, I think this is the cultural side of it, where there are other players in dressing rooms who are uncomfortable having him in the dressing room. There is the lifestyle choices that made him a loner from his teammates. There was the ostracization he had felt. And I think as far as scoring goals, he was still able to score goals, but he was never as quick or as explosive after that knee injury. And it's like so many people who blow out their knees in various sports. They don't come back as quite the same player. I mean, this is part of the reason why, if you talk about American football, why running backs don't last very long, right? Their professional careers are much shorter than quarterbacks or wide receivers.
The hits
yeah. And I think for him, being the styled center forward he was in that era and then blowing out his knee, that just kind of did it.
And this is also probably part of the reason why he played in so many countries, on so many teams. He played in the UK, the US, Canada, Sweden, and he couldn't stick or stay with any of them, and it probably had to do a little bit with everything.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. And the contrast is, again, with his brother. I mean, his brother is such an important part of the story. His brother is at Norwich with him, starting out with him at Norwich, because, of course, they grew up in the Norfolk area under foster parents, and never really breaks into the Norwich team. Justin breaks in, becomes a star, moves on, and eventually John ends up in London at Millwall and does decently well, and transfers to Wimbledon and becomes a legend at the club. You know, lasts there for 8 years, scores over 100 goals for them, and at the time when there was a certain craziness, they were called the Crazy Gang at Wimbledon at the time. He under several different managers, including Joe Kinnear, that he had this this great career, and there was unfortunately part of Justin's vices at that time was the contrast that was constantly drawn between his younger brother and him. So John was this really good, effective footballer who fit in to the culture, was settled, basically played only for a couple of clubs in his career, a handful of clubs, had what you would consider a normal career of a successful English footballer. Justin was the exact opposite. And I think it allowed people also to cloak their racism in a way by saying, hey, we like his brother. His brother is great. What we say about him is not racist.
Right. Right.
So it just turned out to be this horrible thing. And eventually, of course, maybe I'm jumping ahead here, but Justin is running out of money. He's going from club to club, including some of the ones I mentioned: Man City, Newcastle, West Ham, and of course the time he had spent in the U.S. and Canada with the LA club at the time in the outdoor league and the Edmonton team. He's running out of money, and he decides to sell his story and come out of the closet and sell his story to the Sun, which just made matters a lot worse.
Yeah. How did the Sun figure into all of this? Did they push Justin into admitting something he should have never admitted to? How does the Sun play into all of this?
Yeah, the Sun had a very seedy reputation at the time. This is just for the context of our listeners who might have seen recently the ESPN 30 for 30 on Hillsborough and the Hillsborough Stadium disaster.
Right.
This is a year after that, and the Sun had written slanderous articles and posted slanderous pictures. Not posted. There's no internet in those days. Published slanderous pictures of the disaster and the victims. And to this day, you cannot. Most merchants in Liverpool won't carry the Sun. So it was seen as a scandal sheet, a tabloid, something that a lot of football fans decried, but then a lot of the kind of meat and potatoes is an American term, but that kind of working class British consumer read the Sun. And Justin's theory was, or at least how he represented it before he died, was that he felt like they were going to hound him and they were going to out him. And he was going to be outed in the tabloids anyway, probably in the Sun or in the News of the World or one of the other big tabloids. So why not cash in? Why not sell my story? Now, the thing he did that I think further turned the public against him was he not only came out of the closet, but he began naming people he had allegedly had sexual liaisons with, whether
in Parliament and all sorts of places.
Yeah. And I think at that point, a lot of people felt like he was selling his story because he had bankrupted himself. He had not fulfilled his potential. He had spent money on fast cars and whatever else, and that he was just trying to capitalize on this and get one last big payday. And again, this is going on at the very same time that his brother is playing probably the best football of his career at Wimbledon.
Wow.
And it just, I don't know how much that played into it, but in fact, Justin and John didn't really speak after the revelations in the Sun, and John had urged him not to come out and say this. This is we talked about Hillsborough and Liverpool. One of the most famous games in that era was when Wimbledon beat Liverpool in the FA Cup final a year or two earlier with John starting, and it was billed in the British press as the rags against the riches, the rags being Wimbledon, the riches being Liverpool. And John had started in that game, and his best season was actually the season right after these revelations were made about his brother and the Sun. Just coincidence, probably. I don't know if that necessarily motivated him or fed him, but he was one of the leading scorers in the then First Division, which became the Premier League 2 years later, in the 90-91 season. And at that time, Justin is still kind of a vagabond. He's now not only been seen as a guy who washed away his career, but now he's gotten universal social condemnation and rejection in his home country.
From 1991 through 1997, Justin scored 35 times in 90 games. Obviously, a terrific goal-to-game ratio. But at age 36, he had had enough and turned his attention to coaching, and it was here in the U.S. that he had hoped to launch a successful coaching career. But this is where it all went wrong and where Justin's story takes a horrible turn for the worse. He signs on to become the coach of the Maryland Mania of the A-League, but never gets to the point where he actually coaches a regular season game. He was accused of sexual assault. Justin Fashanu, fearing he would never get a fair trial, fled the U.S., went back home to England, and 2 months later was found hanging with a suicide note nearby that claimed whatever sex there was consensual. What I find curious is that after this alleged assault took place, he leaves Maryland, goes back home, and John claims after Justin committed suicide, John claimed that Justin wasn't gay, that he was just a lost soul. What happened? How did someone's life that had so much promise spiral so terribly like this?
That's just the $6 million question, right? I mean, I guess there was perhaps the influence of the money and alcohol, because I said earlier I didn't want to say he would go on benders, because that would equate him with like Georgie Best and other great English footballers that kind of flushed their career down the toilet. And I mentioned Johnny Football earlier, right? Guys like that. It was certainly more complicated than that, but I think alcohol probably played a part, as did just the desire to be different and to stand out differently. And I think his brother never really understood him. Now he's come to grips with everything.
There's guilt there. There's guilt there. There's a lot of guilt there.
Yeah, and that the last 7 years of Justin's life, they really didn't speak. And obviously, this thing had happened in Maryland, which led directly, as you mentioned, to Justin's suicide. At the time, and Justin in his suicide note said it was consensual sex. It apparently was, but at the time, homosexuality was illegal in Maryland.
And with a minor.
And with a minor, right? Even though had it been a heterosexual act, I guess that he would not have been considered a minor under Maryland statute. All of that having been said, so he takes off from Maryland, comes back to London, commits suicide, and I think still for the next few years, John is trying to justify everything that happened. And as you said, and I think you're absolutely spot on, there was a lot of guilt there.
Right. The beginning of my show, I always say that Sports Forgotten Heroes is about the people who we don't necessarily remember. They're not on the tips of our tongue. Guys who had great careers, a great season, or just one great game that we remember for whatever reason. Justin Fashanu had that one great game against Liverpool, and that catapulted him into another stratosphere.
Yeah.
Can you consider him, can he be considered a hero? Can he be considered a hero for the right reasons? In your mind, your estimation, can Justin Fashanu be considered a hero?
Yeah, I think now that we've come to grips with the kind of social stigma that homosexuality in sports brought you, and then to add the layer that he was black, I think it's one of these things where the pioneers, it never really goes well for them. I would draw the direct comparison with Curt Flood in baseball, right?
Yeah.
I think it's a similar story. Obviously, it's different. This is social. Well, it's actually not that different. I think Curt Flood paid the price. His career went down the drain. But if it weren't for him, I can't even name the number. Thousands of Major League Baseball players would not have had the opportunity they had.
Right,
if not
and just
for him.
real quickly for the listeners who don't know who Curt Flood is, he's technically, or well, not technically, but he's basically baseball's first free agent, and free agency is all because of Curt Flood.
Yeah, and I think free agency in every American sport, because what happened was uh, he sued. Free agency comes. The Major League Baseball Players Union becomes very strong, and the NBA kind of follows, and the NFL. I'm old enough now to remember the fights over free agency in the NFL, and it was. I mean, the the owners didn't want to give an inch, but what ended up happening is because of the precedent set by Curt Flood and set by baseball. They eventually won. Although you could still argue there's a lot of collusion between owners in the NFL that keeps wages down. But so I think Justin was a similar figure. Nowadays, if somebody has a kind of flamboyant lifestyle and is different off the pitch and might be homosexual or might be bisexual, might be different than his teammates, there isn't the kind of social stigma. Now, there might be still some problems in the dressing room. Don't get me wrong. I think that there are still those issues in American sports as well. But the media and many fans are very different in how they view things. And I think what's happened in the last 19 years since Justin committed suicide, since he hung himself, is that there is been a gradual, didn't happen overnight, a gradual revisionism in taking him from being a guy who flushed down his career down the drain to being a guy that was unfortunate, and now to basically being a hero, being a pioneer. And that same kind of evolution happened with Curt Flood, by the way. And I think as we get further and further away from his suicide and from his career, his legend continues to grow.
That's awesome. Sum up his career for me. What should we remember about Justin Fashanu?
Supremely talented, a guy who could make magic happen on the pitch, but had all of these inner demons and psychological factors that prevented him from ever being truly accepted within the game and fulfilling the potential that we know he had, and the potential that we saw his brother follow through on. And his brother had a great career in club football and also played for England, and was one of the last cuts, I think, from the 1990 World Cup team. So he could have been that. He could have been better than his brother.
That's great stuff, Kartik. We could talk forever and ever and ever. I know it's a podcast, but at some point you got to say, what a great conversation, and I think we had a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes to talk about a soccer player who had so much potential and a life that ended so tragically.
Thank you so much, and keep up the good work doing what you're doing.
Thanks, Kartik. Hey, and I hope you'll consider joining me again sometime.
Oh, absolutely. I had a blast.
Over the course of his career, Justin scored 133 goals in 365 games, and that includes stints with too many teams to name, but a great goals-to-game ratio. His best years came from 1982 through 1985 when he scored 20 goals for Notts County, 1989 when he found the back of the net 17 times in 26 games for the Edmonton Brickmen, and from 1991 through 1993 when he notched 15 goals for Torquay United in 41 games. Oh, and for the England U21 national team, he scored 5 times in 11 appearances. Finding the back of the net was not a problem for Justin. In fact, his brother John did quite well too, scoring 149 goals in 394 games, including 107 for Wimbledon over 8 years. Off the field, however, for Justin was where his problems occurred, and much of that could, and I stress could, have been a result from that one great goal he scored against Liverpool. There's a terrific documentary about Justin, and you can see it on YouTube, and I have a link to it on our website, sportsfh.com. Speaking of sportsfh.com, it's filled with information on all guests who have appeared on the podcast. You can see who else is scheduled to appear and so much more, including how you can show your support. In fact, just go to patreon.com/sportsfh, and I have a link on sportsfh.com. That's patreon.com/sportsfh. And of course, we could always use your support. Next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we'll turn our attention to the NBA and one of its long-lost teams, the Buffalo Braves. Thanks for listening, and thank you again to today's guest, Kartik Krishnaiyer. See you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday's Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.